Each literary period relies on a characteristic understanding of nature. Postmodernism takes nature to be a phenomenological construct, which implies that nature is a matter of perspective. In its extreme form, namely true fantasy, the fantastic always problematizes perspective. Thus, postmodern literature has a theoretical affinity for the fantastic. In Italo Calvino's fantastic Cosmicomics, we see, using the analytic ideas of Northrop Frye, how postmodernism develops its own myths. In Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time, we see how postmodernism calls into question individual perception. And in Magical Realism, which flows from the work of writers like Jorge Luis Borges and includes Gabriel García Márquez's 100 Years of Solitude and Laura Esquivel's Like Water for Chocolate, we see how, as Calvino and Piercy had implied, postmodernism offers a fantastic new framework for understanding ourselves in society. Our aesthetic period is often called postmodern. Postmodernism, as I said, has a natural affinity for the fantastic. What is postmodernism? The Oxford Companion to Philosophy defines postmodernism as pursuing themes of self-reflexivity, or the puzzles induced by allowing language to become the object of its own scrutiny, in a kind of dizzying rhetorical regress. But we found this already in true fantasies like those of Lewis Carroll. When Alice is stuck in the tree, she says, I used to read fairy tales, and now I'm in one. The complete regress based on the shifts of language shifting from one world to another, one ontological realm to another. Outside reader, reading about a world, being in the world, thinking about the world within the world, and so on ad infinitum. Another definition, this one, believe it or not, the official definition of the United States State Department, says that postmodernism is characterized by open-endedness and collage. It questions the foundations of cultural and artistic forms through self-referential irony. Self-reference, self-referentiality, these come up again and again in the definitions of postmodernism. But we found this self-referentiality in all true fantasies, for example, in E.T.A. Hoffmann's The Golden Pot, where at the end we don't know whether the character is off in Atlantis, stuck in an inkwell, or just hallucinating. This dependence upon individual perspective is made clear in a work like Emmet by Jorge Luis Borges, one of the great writers of the 20th century. While not a true fantasy, this story makes clear the postmodern aesthetic and its real-world implications. The story of Emmet is the story of a woman whose father has been cheated out of his half of a company by his partner, while Emma herself was still a little girl. Years pass. The family is disgraced because the partner had made it appear that her father had committed some larceny against the company. The father has gone off in disgrace from Europe to South America. She's lost touch with him because he needs to evade the law. But finally, years later, when she's an adult, a letter arrives from a friend of her father's explaining that the father has now died and what the situation really was. Emma decides that she must have vengeance on the factory owner for what he has done to her family. So, she goes down to the port. She finds a sailor from a ship that's due to leave the next day. Although a virgin, she entices him up to her room and submits to sexual relations, which utterly disgust her. Then she calls up the factory owner and tells him that there is the possibility of a strike. She, as one of the workers, has heard this. He says that she should come up and talk with him, and they meet in his office. There is, in fact, a gun in the drawer of his desk. This is how the story ends. After she shoots him, she picked up the telephone and repeated what she would repeat so many times again, and with these and with other words. Something incredible has happened. Mr. Lowenthal had me come over on the pretext of the strike. He abused me. I killed him. Actually, the story was incredible, but it impressed everyone because, substantially, it was true. True was Emmet Sunz's tone. True was her shame. True was her hate. True was also the outrage she had suffered. Only the circumstances were false, the time, and one or two proper names. This is fundamental postmodernism. The things we think of as details become irrelevant. The feelings, the perceptions, the truth of the human engagement as it shapes our understanding of the world as a phenomenological construct, an intentional act of our consciousness. This is what we see as important in the postmodern period. Of course, since fantasy is always about our understanding, there is a natural affinity between the postmodern and fantastic. Postmodernism takes nature, including the physical world, and even the self, excuse me, as a phenomenological construct. Individual sentences can show this convergence of postmodernism and the fantastic. Take this self-reflexive example. This is one sentence I can never say, but I've just said it. There are unresolved structural ambiguities. I walked down the street and turned into a drugstore. Poof. I'm a newspaper stand, or indeed I made a left. We also see in individual sentences reversals of the ground rules of the narrative world. One of my all-time favorites is, I feel more like I did when I came in here than I do now. I feel more like I did when I came in here than I do now. As you read through that sentence or think about it, from any given word to any given word, none of the rules of grammar are broken. But by the time we get to the end, it makes no sense whatsoever. Everything depends upon our perspective. Postmodernism and true fantasy problematize the world. Yet while the challenging play of postmodernism may seem inherently destructive of many certainties, it can also be constructive. We have seen that the fantastic is one key tool in artistic evolution. For example, we have the detective story, where we have the crux come in the middle in the purloined letter. As time goes on, that crux moves further and further toward the end, so that by the time we get to Agatha Christie, we're unloading all of the mystery in the last few pages of a lengthy novel. But eventually, something called aesthetic fatigue sets in, and people get tired of just that same old form. And so people begin to apply the fantastic, among other devices, to make the genre fresh again. One way to do that is to ironize it, to use irony. But Robbe-Grillet turns that whole form inside out by making the detective fail and the reader succeed by putting the solution not at the end, but in the middle. The fantastic is one of the driving tools for the evolution of genres. It grows out of a certain kind of irony. Now, Northrop Frye, in The Anatomy of Criticism, suggests one of the consequences of the evolution of genres. He says that with any large, dominating kind of story, let's say, for example, the story of Boy Meets Girl, or the story of the founding of a nation, we can see that story represented, in a sense, in a series of different manners. The first manner he associates with spring. This is the comic manner, the manner in which whatever problems exist, we see finally at the end are to be solved because society has reconstituted itself. As that form develops, it moves into the summer. And in the summer, we see romance. It's not just a matter of the story ending with the children of the opposing houses promising marriage, but in fact, the children in the opposing houses now have a love affair. In the fall, we see the same form carried out as tragedy. In fact, the love affair turns bad. One dies, for example, or a father discovers it and forces the couple to part. Further along, we see the same material handled in the winter. In the winter, when it's cold and we're distant, we ironize what's going on. We make fun of such trivial notions as romantic love. We may, in fact, have bitterness or satire. But then, Frye suggests, the same material will continue to develop. And as it develops, although Frye does not say this, it will use the fantastic to change into, as it were in a musical analogy, a new key. And in getting back to comedy in its new form, it will pass through a phase which he calls myth. I'd like to suggest to you that Italo Calvino, perhaps the greatest fantasist of 20th century Italy, exemplifies this in work after work. One of my favorite books of Calvino's is one called Cosmicomics. In Cosmicomics, we have a single character named QFWFQ. Every story begins with an epigraph that says something about what really happened in science. It's accurate from what we understand of science. Then, blah, 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 said, and then follows the rest of the story. The story is always based on some perceptual understanding of that scientific fact. One of my favorites is called All at One Point. It begins with a little epigraph explaining that Hubble made us realize that all of the stars are flying away from us at ever-increasing speeds, and therefore we can infer that once upon a time all of the universe was all at one point, the name of the story. In those days, said, and then he goes on to tell what it was like when everything lived all at one point. He makes bizarre puns like the zoo family that always had its laundry drying and wanted to hang lines across our point. The very use of the language is postmodern. It's fantastic. It makes us laugh. The zoo family, it turns out, have many, many, many items with them, chests and clothes and old detritus that they've picked up along on their travels, and they are known as the immigrants and are looked down upon. Although, of course, the narrator says, there could be no idea of immigrant when there was no place to come from, and besides which we were all living there at one point. The great wonder of that point is a Mrs. Finko, which is how I can only pronounce this word, which actually has parentheses in it and subscripts and so on. Mrs. Finko loves everyone. She, in fact, is having an affair with one man, but on the other hand, perhaps it's not an affair since everybody is living inside everybody else, since everything's all at one point. And then Mrs. Finko says, boys, if I only had some room, what noodles I would make for you. Then begins a sentence which is about a page and a half long, in which there is the imagination of the noodles coming from the flour, which had to be grown in fields, which had to be ripened under a sun, which had to be within a galaxy, which created all of space and all of time, and led to the separation of everyone from Mrs. Finko and everyone regretting that they were now apart. And that's the end of the story. In other words, this postmodern story, told in the most bizarre, imaginative, fantastic way one can imagine, takes a fact of science and understands it thoroughly in human terms and leaves us with an image of the very impulse of love, of generosity, of nurturing, of giving, of sexuality, of inclusion, inherently leading to a downfall not of original sin, but of human separation. This story, all at one point, gives us an image of, I want to, and then we're all apart, that in a way stands for our modern mobile society, where so few of us live near our family, where the extended family is extended all over the map, where we keep in touch by electronic means and rarely get to hug. It seems to me that Frye is right. We've taken the notion of, I want to feed you, that unsaid, implicit activity of love from fairy tales, and made of it a modern myth. The fantastic drives fairy tales all the way to fantasy and through from winter to spring, creating myth along the way. Both postmodernism and fantasy problematize individual perception. Many of the science fictions that we most admire these days raise this issue because, after all, science is about knowing. Philip K. Dick is certainly postmodern and works like A Scanner Darkly and Ubik. A Scanner Darkly tells the story of a man who, so far as he understands, is a drug agent. He infiltrates a group of people who are dealing with drugs. To do so, he deals with drugs. To build up his credibility with them, he takes the drugs, he becomes an addict, and is eventually arrested for being an addict and sent to work on a government work farm as part of his incarceration. And on that work farm, he discovers that he is now made to grow the drugs that the government is supplying that create the condition for which he was supposed to be the solution. Do we know where the government stands in our lives? Do we know that we're the good guys or the bad guys? In Ubik, the good guy keeps watching the very nature of the world change, and at the end, when he disappears, his comrades look in their pockets and take out the money of the new world. They can only tell it's a new world because now it has his face on the coins. How did the world change? It changed because of perception. This is postmodernism. Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time is an extraordinary novel of a poor Latina, Consuelo, who has been abused by the system. We learn at one point, for example, that she's been given an unnecessary hysterectomy by interns at a city hospital because they needed the practice. Her one child, whom she loves desperately, has been taken away from her by social services. She is often locked up in an insane asylum for her own good, of course. At one point, however, sitting in her apartment, she sees someone across the table from her, and this someone is a creature from the future, a human from a better world. And most of the novel is set in that better world, where Consuelo is learning about how the world can become, where women can have their own energy, where in fact men take hormones to be able to breastfeed, and women give up procreation so that men and women can be truly equals. At one other point in the novel, she goes to an alternative future in which every woman is nothing but a sex object or a baby maker, and women are radically, radically suppressed by men. She then finds out that the course of the future depends upon stopping the kinds of people who control the medical establishment and define insanity in our era. And so, when she is back in our era, she poisons the doctors. The result of that act is that she is incarcerated for the rest of her life, and the story tells us at the end that she was sent to the insane prison, followed by a document of 113 pages. It's the language of others that controls us. When we think about this book, we don't know, however, whether Consuelo really was in the future, and this is a science fiction, or it was just a projection on her part. But one way or the other, whether it's science fiction or it's realistic, it's postmodern because it tells us that everything depends upon our perception. Does our perception of the dangers of a situation even go so far in determining reality as to make it legitimate to kill those who are ostensibly trying to help us? Both postmodernism and true fantasy, then, naturally problematize the relations between the world and the individual who perceives it. Gabriel García Márquez, best known for 100 Years of Solitude, is the touchstone author for so-called magical realism, which is a particular variety of postmodernism. My most important problem, García Márquez said, was destroying the lines of demarcation that separate what seems real from what seems fantastic. His sprawling novel combines individual stories, cultural myths, national and international politics. There's a reason he won the Nobel Prize. Magical realism itself narrowly refers to a group of Latin American writers who treat the magical as fully and calmly expected, just as if it were part of the real. For instance, in 100 Years of Solitude, birds float up from the earth. Leaves turn into birds, and ice somehow is brought as a magical object into the jungle without itself ever having been destroyed by the equatorial heat. The key exemplars of this are Isabel Allende, Alejo Carpentier, and Julio Cortázar. But more broadly than this South American group, magical realism includes the postmodernist assault on the previously stable markers of identity, such as race and nation. And therefore it includes such non-Latins as Mikhail Bulgakov, Salman Rushdie, and even Günter Grass. A wonderful work of this variety is Like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel, which has sold over 3 million copies in 30 languages. It's clearly both postmodern and fantastic. The heroine, Tita, cannot express her love except through her cooking. So, when she is feeling bitter, her tears make for food that makes everyone sick. The book begins with a recipe for Christmas rolls. And then the novel starts to talk about Tita's birth. Tita is not allowed to marry in the normal way because her mother claims that in their family they have the tradition that the oldest daughter must care for the mother until the mother dies. There's no such tradition. But in fact, Tita falls desperately in love with a man who, because of the mother's intervention, winds up marrying Tita's sister. He marries her not because he loves her, but because it's a way for him to stay near Tita. You can see the difficulties involved. As the story unfolds, every chapter begins with another month of the year, and there are 12 chapters. Every chapter begins with another recipe. Every chapter goes through a story in which the recipe is made, the directions for the recipe are given, and something fantastic happens because of what that means when the recipe enters into the lives of the people. There are other magical moments as well. For instance, one of Tita's sisters goes into an outhouse, takes a shower. It is so inflamed by the possibilities of the Mexican Revolution that though she is in water, the outhouse bursts into flame, and there she is standing out in the field naked. Along comes a captain of the rebels on his horse, sweeps her up, and off she goes. Later, she comes back into the story, herself having become an officer in the Revolutionary Army. And so we see that the family life that Tita's involved with is part of the politics. She herself is loved by a man named John Brown, an American who bears the name, of course, of a famous but failed revolutionary trying to free the American slaves before the Civil War. For that chapter in which he falls in love with her, the recipe is one for matches. And indeed, we learn how to make matches, and we're told that Tita herself has that heat within her. At the end of the novel, Tita finally decides that she will join Pedro, and the two of them, after her sister's death, go off into a shed that is magically lit by a heaven's worth of candles. He dies in their lovemaking. She eats the candles. She bursts into flame, and the entire ranch goes up in ashes. At the end of the novel, we realize that all along we have been reading the manuscript of one of the children, the niece, of the daughter of the girl, the niece of Tita, whom Tita raised. That is, this is Tita's great niece. And she tells us that after this conflagration, a layer of ash several yards high covered the entire ranch. When Esperanza, my mother, and that name of course means hope, returned from her wedding trip, all that she found under the remains of what had been the ranch was this cookbook, the cookbook that expresses all of Tita's great urges, which she bequeathed to me. That is, Tita gave it to Esperanza, Esperanza gave it to the narrator, when she, Esperanza, died, and which tells in each of its chapters this story of a love interred, this book that has a recipe at the beginning of each chapter. They say that under those ashes, every kind of life flourished, making this land the most fertile in the region. Throughout my childhood, I had the good fortune to savor the delicious fruits and vegetables that grew on the land. Eventually, my mother had a little apartment built there. My father, Alex, still lives in one of the apartments. Everything's been paved over. And yet, this is the narrator's birthday, and she is going to make those Christmas rolls. Somehow she wonders they never taste as good as when my mother made them, and she can only wonder at how good they tasted when her great-aunt Tita made them. The story ends thus. I don't know why mine never turn out like hers, or why my tears flow so freely when I prepare them. Perhaps I am as sensitive to onions, which is not only a vegetable, but an image for meaning within meaning within meaning, as Tita, my great-aunt, who will go on living as long as there is someone who cooks her recipes. You can see what Gabriel García Márquez meant when he said that magical realism really was real. It was just destroying the difference, the demarcations, the boundaries between the real and the fantastic. By the end of that book, we do believe that Tita will live as long as someone makes those recipes. And I have to say, I feel the impulse to make those recipes myself. And how can great Aunt Tita live when she never lived? She's always been a character of fiction. In fact, what Laura Esquivel has done is, using postmodernism, using the fantastic, created what becomes a modern myth. Thus, the fantastic, which once drove the culturally foundational works like the Odyssey with its gods and so on, its curses, its magical changes of men into animals, it again, the fantastic, drives narrative that is broadly powerful, artistically honored, and personally moving. As in this imaginative novel, the fantastic is at the center of our lives. But in the 21st century, our lives are conditioned powerfully not only by our perceptions of the world, but by the world is made to change, by the development of science and technology. And so, when I say that the fantastic is at the center of our lives, I mean that, of course, in the general sense in which we've discussed this for the last 12 lectures, but also in the specific sense in which it's incorporated in science fiction, which will be our subject in Part 2.